So there you go. It is November 10th. Monday, November 10th. Is it? Is it November 10th? It's not Monday. It's Friday, right? It's Friday. Okay, Friday, November. Yeah, I got to get my days screwed. Now I should be getting myself back on track because I went to New York this week. So that should keep me lined up, although I still got my days mixed up, apparently. All right. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing the Native people. We look back at our glorious and our great history and look back and a look at where we're at now and look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe, CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com. And, of course, we are streaming live on Facebook. And for those of you who are following us on Facebook, look for the stream and offer your comments. And especially during the breaks, I'll get a chance to catch up on the comments. And perhaps your comments will weigh in or will add to the conversation that I'm trying to have here on a variety of different issues. And of course, the main issue for me is that tomorrow is Canandaigua Treaty Day. So we'll talk about that. I am John Kane. I'm your show's host and producer. And I do have Jake Proud in studio, who is manning our cameras for not only the Facebook live stream, but for what we'll also put up on our YouTube channel, Let's Talk Native TV. And I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and catch our videos there. Not only do we put up the videos from the shows, but we also record and produce some shorter videos that are more, one topic at a time kind of thing. I spent a lot of time doing these YouTube videos addressing the conflicts the Seneca Nation has with with New York State on a variety of things. But and you know what, this show will kind of capture some of that, I think, and I think it's I think people have to understand what is the relationship. What is the deal, and I think with tomorrow being Canandaigua Treaty Day, I think it's it would be interesting to catch some of that language from the Canandaigua Treaty, and the other thing that happens on Canandaigua Treaty Day, not only do a bunch of people show up in the little village of Canandaigua and they do a march, and there's a lot of the kumbaya moments between state reps and federal reps and Native reps, not just the Seneca Nation. Now, the Canandaigua Treaty is considered a treaty with the Six Nations, although we could debate whether all Six Nations were really participants in that. It's not a debate. We weren't all participating in that treaty, but I will say that there's language in the Canandaigua Treaty that I think is worth reciting, and I mention it often, and not because I think the treaty necessarily is completely valid as far as I'm concerned, but it does make clear what is the position that the United States had and should have, because nothing's changed, towards things like land title, towards whose land our territory is. And one of the things that I cite all the time is there is language specifically in the Canandaigua Treaty, and it's mentioned three times. Three times the United States says, now the United States will acknowledge that the land is yours, and the United States will never claim the same, nor disturb you or your allies in the free use and enjoyment of your land. So that language, the United States acknowledges that our property, that our land is ours, and the United States will never claim the same. Never meaning never. And of course, I take it back. At the end of that, it says, until such a time, until you decide to sell. And there's no question that the lands managed to be ceded, however that took place, whether it was legitimate or otherwise, but not all of it. So regardless of how you feel about the lands that are ceded in treaties, and obviously I have a strong opinion about that, what is clear is that we still retain land. It might be a shadow of what we once held, but there's no question that the Seneca Nation, specifically here, retains the territory of Cattaraugus, the territory of Allegheny, land out in Oil Springs, and it's important to note that the reclamation of lands in both Niagara Falls and in Buffalo, and a few other parcels around, that utilized the land acquisitions clause of the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act, puts that land in the same status as the rest of Seneca territory. So even Niagara Falls, the lands where the casinos are on in Niagara Falls and Buffalo, those lands, just like Cattaraugus and Allegheny, are not part of the United States. Now, of course, I'm saying it here on the radio. I'm saying it into my microphone here. But you know what? We didn't say it first. Well, maybe I take it back. Maybe I've always said it first. But the fact of the matter is that the United States has clearly said it as well. And they clearly said it in Canandaigua. And I think that's what we really do have to understand that. We really do have to understand that the United States said that. They said that the land is, they acknowledged. They didn't give us our land. I mean, let me be clear. They didn't give us our land. They didn't grant us some sort of title to our land. They acknowledged that our land is ours. Now, this is in 1794. So this is after the discovery and after after Christopher Columbus's claimed discovery of the Caribbean islands. But 30 years after Canandaigua, in 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court would codify into law language associated with the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery. This whole idea that the Christian nations of Europe could lay claim to title to land, provided no other Christians were there. So this was based purely on religion, purely on race, because the white Christian nations of Europe are the ones that were utilizing this doctrine of Christian discovery. But in spite of Justice John Marshall citing the doctrine of discovery and saying things like, our sovereignty was necessarily diminished upon discovery. I mean, he said that. It doesn't explain why. And, of course, this is in 1823, 30 years after it is clear that we did have title to land, because George Washington, the general and the first president of the United States, would make it very, very clear that the United States recognized that the lands the Six Nations retained, not just the Senecas. I mean, it was cited 3 times, but and one time they cite specifically the Senecas, but that the lands the Six Nations retained, that it was ours, and that the United States would never claim the same. In fact, even though that's said in 1794, and then this doctrine of discovery would be thrown into the legal dicta from Johnson v. McIntosh and 30 years later, as the removal era was in full swing, and they were trying to even convince the Senecas and all the Haudenosaunee, basically all Native people, to move west of the Mississippi. When the Senecas asked, well, how would that land title be held? The United States had to formulate the language specific to the Senecas as they were considering, as this was being proposed to them to move to Kansas, and say, no, the land that you would be moving to in Kansas would be yours. And it would be yours in the same way that the land that we're trying to move you off of is yours right now. And the United States would never claim it. They will never make it a state. It would never be a part of a state or a U.S. territory. It would be yours. It would be Seneca land. So they were already, and again, they were trying to reiterate what was reiterated in 1794, in spite of Johnson v. McIntosh, in spite of the doctrine of discovery being incorporated into this American law mindset, and codified into U.S. law. And again, let me just to be clear, what Justice John Marshall said in 1823 was that Native people didn't own title to land, that we merely had the right of occupancy, and that only the Christian nations of Europe, who either through discovery or through transfer amongst themselves, could claim title to land. That's what Justice John Marshall said in Johnson v. McIntosh. And of course, that is completely contradicted by the language of Canandaigua from 30 years prior, and completely contradicted again when there was an effort to move the Senecas. And of course, here's the other thing that's interesting. In 2005, the Supreme Court would, through Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal justice on the court, would actually cite in her footnotes in a ruling against the Oneidas in their reacquisition of lands within their claim area, an area that they have a lawful claim, a ruling within the Supreme Court in their favor. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites a bunch of these legal doctrines, one called the doctrine of impossibility, which says, no, once that land has gone out of your sovereign control, it's impossible for it to ever return. That's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited. She cited that as a specific, and again, that's what she called it, the doctrine of impossibility. And of course, she cited, again, the land title issues associated with what she called the transfer of title to the sovereigns after discovery, meaning the Great Britain and ultimately the United States and the individual states, citing the doctrine of Christian discovery in 2005. So it goes back and forth. Now, having cited that in 2005, here's the other contradiction. In 1990, the Senecas would have an act of Congress passed through the legislature, signed by the President of the United States, to resolve the fraud that was committed on a 99-year lease of lands that the city of Salamanca are located on, of the Allegheny territory of the Seneca Nation. And like $60 million would be awarded to the Senecas. Some of that money from the state, some of it from the federal government, and there'd be other provisions about how the Senecas could take land off the tax rolls if a Seneca bought property, and there's a whole lot of things. But one of the things at the tail end of that is, again, this is the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act of 1990. There's a provision in there that says the Senecas can reacquire lost lands. They could reacquire lands that were their ancestral lands, and it's a streamlined process. Nobody else has this. Only the Senecas have this. So they could reacquire lands that were previously theirs with money from the settlement, as a matter of fact, and that land would be held in the same status as the lands that they have continuously retained. Now, that's a complete contradiction. That's 1990. In 2005, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites in Oneida that it's impossible for lands to be reclaimed, that's simply not true. And shame on the lawyers for the Oneidas who failed to mention that there is not just a precedent in courts, but there is a specific act of Congress that seemed to have no problem with the Senecas reclaiming lands that were lost. So when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this liberal Jewish justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, says, no, there's a thing we call the doctrine of an impossibility, and that means it's impossible for you to reclaim your lands. Well, that's simply not true. Now, I say all this because this is still obviously, the last court ruling is the Supreme Court ruling, and of course there was even rulings associated with the Seneca's claim on Grand Island that has been very much manipulated by fraud to have that case thrown out. But clearly the Oneidas case, which should have been an easy one, this isn't about trying to win land in court. This is about land they reacquired within their claim area. And the city of Sherrill says, no, you can't do that. You can't take it off the tax rolls. And the Supreme Court rules in their favor based on the doctrine of Christian discovery, this doctrine of impossibility, even though both the doctrine of Christian discovery was contradicted by Canandaigua and the doctrine of impossibility was contradicted by the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act. So these contradictions couldn't be more clear because, when they cite these things, when they cite the doctrine of Christian discovery or this doctrine of impossibility, they're not citing where these so-called doctrines have been applied to us. They cite it where it's been applied to other people, other native territories. And I'm not even saying that that's appropriate, but clearly it is not appropriate to apply that stuff to us because we have very, very specific language. So again, here you have this Canandaigua Treaty, regardless of how legitimate the treaty actually is, because again, I'm not sure that it was probably ratified either by the U.S. Senate or the president for that matter. I'm not even sure. And I know that it wasn't properly ratified by the Six Nations because this is considered a treaty with the Six Nations. I know the Mohawks weren't represented in that treaty, and in fact, under the Guyana de Goa, no actions of the Haudenosaunee of the Iroquois Confederacy, whatever you want to, the Six Nations, are legal without participation of Mohawks. That's simply in the Guyana de Goa. That's simply in our law. So I know that it's questionable, but here's a couple of things that aren't questionable. That this language was written by them. This whole idea of acknowledging that our property is ours. And the interesting thing is, if somebody's going to claim, well, that's an old treaty, it's not really relevant. Well, it's funny because the only part of that treaty that is still honored today, because, I mean, let's be honest, the United States is really troubled by acknowledging that the lands that we live on are not part of the United States. In fact, they've passed laws like Public Law 232 and 233 that somehow the federal government is claiming that New York State can claim civil and criminal jurisdiction on our territories. Well, how could they do that if the land's not part of the United States? So there's a problem there. They've got lines on their maps they consider part of Seneca territory and all of our territories in their congressional districts, in their state legislative districts. So their maps don't just block out or black out our territories. They used to. Before the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, the state was clearly acknowledging, the federal government was clearly acknowledging that our lands, that they still couldn't lay claim to our lands. But somewhere after 1924, when they decided that they're going to declare that we were all citizens, another illegal act, they made assumptions going forward. I mean, there's nothing written any place that says, okay, the land is hereby considered part of the United States. No, that doesn't exist anywhere. There's no transfer of our land title or our sovereignty to New York State or to the United States. That simply just doesn't exist. But these contradictions, continue to present itself. Even though, again, if you look at the Canandaigua Treaty, is pretty easy to read. There's only 7 articles. One of them is about building a road. One of them is about compensation. And that compensation, this is what I was getting to. I mean, obviously, the lands that were ceded, that's still recognized. I mean, the United States didn't say, okay, we don't recognize the treaty anymore, so we're giving you your land back. In fact, the United States still recognizes the Canandaigua Treaty in one aspect that that many Native people consider a solemn aspect, because in the language they talked about making a payment to the Six Nations forever, and that payment was for livestock. It was for for animals, for farm implements, for equipment, for clothing, for materials, for cloth. Now, in 1794, it was $4,500 worth of stuff. You could buy quite a bit of stuff with $4,500 in 1794. In 2017, it's still $4,500. You can't buy much with $4,500. And in fact, what they've been doing for quite a long time, because you can buy so very little with $4,500, is they've just been buying cloth. No farm animals, no equipment, no tractors, nothing like that. No, they've been just buying cloth. And so it's called treaty cloth. Now, there's no specific mention of treaty cloth in the treaty, but that's all they buy with that 45. And now think about it. There's about 100,000 of us, Haudenosaunee. That's about 4.5 cents worth of cloth a piece. So, I mean, I know a lot of people treat that as like, I joke about it. I say they treat it as if it's a shroud of Turin. But, here's the thing. What the treaty cloth does represent is that the United States still is acknowledging, although they seem to be cherry picking, acknowledging the words in that treaty. And the words couldn't be more clear about the United States saying that they will never claim the lands that we retain. Now, they say we could sell it to them, which they have the right to buy and that kind of stuff. That's the language they put in there. In fact, they treated when they say the land is yours and the United States will never claim the same nor interfere with the free use and enjoyment of that land until or unless you choose to sell it, which the United States has the right to buy. They treated that as if they had like the first right of refusal, like they were the only ones who could who the Haudenosaunee could sell their lands to. Now we never necessarily agreed to that, but that's the United States interpretation of that treaty. So the United States, in that language, very specifically says the United States will never claim our lands. Now, here's what I will say: the United States hasn't always fulfilled its $4,500 obligation, and obviously they never adjusted it for cost of living or anything else. That's obvious because all that's getting paid out is $4,500 worth of cloth this many years later. But what is clear is that they are still making the payment. So they can't say that that they've that the treaty is archaic and meaningless. I mean, they've got some poor joker down in Washington whose job it is to requisition $4,500 worth of cloth each year. But so it does acknowledge that treaty exists. Now, here's the problem with what's going to take place tomorrow in Canandaigua, and it takes every year. Every year on November 11th, people gather there and they praise this treaty, and they talk about how it's still valid, and it's I've listened to to folks from the Confederacy, and these people from legal scholars, native legal scholars, say that this is the preeminent treaty. This is the treaty of all treaties for the Haudenosaunee in the United States. Well, the problem is they aren't acknowledging it. They aren't following it. They've breached it. They've breached it in their claims over jurisdiction over our lands. They've breached it in many aspects of it. They have committed fraud in terms of laying claims to our lands after that. I mean, you take it right up to I've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, how the state of New York pressured the Senecas for the Thruway property, paid them $70,000 for it. The way that the United States claimed condemned 10,000 acres of land for the Kinzua Reservoir for putting a dam up to protect, supposedly protect the Pittsburgh from being flooded. They clearly have violated the Canandaigua Treaty over and over and over again. And today, if you were to ask these folks, do you recognize that this land is not part of the United States? You would be hard-pressed to find anybody in New York State or the United States who will acknowledge that. If I was going to go to Canandaigua tomorrow during the celebration, I'd be asking the federal representatives that. How is it we can come together here every year and hold up this yellow document with a bunch of X's on it, claiming that it's legitimate because you guys are still paying $4,500 worth of cloth each year, when you can't acknowledge what is specifically acknowledged in the treaty, that the land is ours. It's not yours. It's not land that look, there's lands that are considered trust lands. There are lands, and both on the U.S. and Canadian side, most of what is quote unquote considered Indian country are lands that the United States claims to hold the title to. And that's what they call trust lands. They're holding it in trust for us. So they're holding the title to our land for our use and enjoyment. That's almost all native territory on the Canadian side. They claim that. And most of it on the U.S. side is claimed that way. The exception to that is our lands. On our lands, they say, well, no, your lands are you have clear title to your lands. Okay, but clear title, are you saying clear U.S. title to our lands? Because that's wrong too. We don't have clear U.S. title. We have original title to our lands. And how do we know that? Because you said it in your own words in 1794. And you acknowledged it through most of the next century. So, and that's not why it's still ours, but that shows that you guys wrote this stuff down on your own documents. And you hold them up every year in Canandaigua as if it's, some solemn promise that you're keeping when you're not. Now, if I went to Canandaigua every year, I would be raising issues about how the United States and New York State are violating this treaty, are violating the promises and the acknowledgments they made in that document. Yeah, you're cutting a check for $4,500 worth of cloth every year. Big freaking deal. But what you're not doing is you're not acknowledging that the land isn't part of New York State and it's not part of the United States. Your word said it in 1794, and like I said, it was acknowledged through most of the next century. But today, you can't let those words come out of your mouth. And that's a problem, because that's where we have problems with everything from jurisdictional issues to our trade and even this battle with the state of New York over revenue sharing. I mean, let's face it, there are people in Albany and Niagara Falls and Buffalo and Salamanca, a lot of citizenry who believe that our doing gaming is something that we can only do with permission from New York State or permission from the United States. That we can only do it when they let us do it. And if they let us do it, that somehow we have some sort of financial obligation to them, which is false. I mean, even under the federal law that is supposed to regulate native gaming, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, that's not true. But see, that's still the sentiment that's out there. Then you got a guy like Andrew Cuomo who runs to the press as well. The Senate, they have a history of breaking agreements. Really? Well, how about let's sit down and do a reading of Canandaigua, Mr. Governor, and let's see who's violated it. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a break, but when I come back, this is my other main point of contention with Canandaigua Treaty Day. Is not only do they hold up this yellow document with a bunch of X's for signatures for Native people on it, but they also bring out a wampum belt, and that wampum belt is called the Washington Belt, and they try to suggest, and I don't mean just they, I mean Orrin Lyons and Sid Hill and Jake Edwards and these guys from Onondaga and all these scholars come out, these iconic figures in Indian country that come out and say, "Oh, look, that's our wampum belt." No, it isn't. It's not our wampum belt. It was a belt that Washington had commissioned to communicate a completely different set of arrangements, completely different than with the language of the Canandaigua Treaty. I'm going to talk about that when we come back. It is our special month, which kicked off on November 1st, which was, as I've mentioned before, is the anniversary of the opening of the Canandaigua, or the Carlisle Indian School. The other thing that's happening today is that today, actually tomorrow is Veterans Day. November 11th is Veterans Day. And it's observed today. Kids were off from school and that kind of stuff. And of course, I've oftentimes expressed my concern about what has become of the military industrial complex. And with that in mind, I've got to offer up my friend Buffy St. Marie's song on Universal Soldier. So here we go. We'll take a break on this. Here's Buffy St. Marie.
He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu, an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill. You for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA, and he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way. And he's fighting for democracy democracy, he's fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die. And he never sees the writing on the walls. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to the war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. But his orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
All right, that's Buffy St. Marie, and you gotta love that. You gotta love her message there. I mean, honestly, let's be honest. Without soldiers, armies can't go to war, and when you look at how the United States is using its military, and I'm not condemning anybody who has served, or especially people who are proud of their parents and grandparents and their aunts and their uncles and the brothers and their cousins who have served. But I know there's a variety of reasons to enlist in the armed forces. But I agree with Buffy St. Marie that if we stop providing them the boots on the ground, then we force nations to be more diplomatic. We force them to resolve conflicts without committing the ultimate conflict, the spilling of blood, to resolve this stuff. So happy to play Universal Soldier on the United States U.S. Veterans Day. Hey, look, I want to thank my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises. I want to thank Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Scott Snyder, Neville Spring, Sugar Montour, and the Seneca Nation for supporting the work that I do here. Not only here, but the work that I do by taking my voice to New York City and to carry a Native perspective on issues that affect all of us, including 8 or 10 million people in New York City, but certainly that entire radio market. So I want to thank them. I also want to thank Unity Stream, Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE for both the simulcast and the rebroadcast, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. I also want to thank all of you who share the show. You share the Facebook live stream. You share the SoundCloud postings. You share, you share what I write as well, and I appreciate that. That helps get a message out there. And the other thing is, I appreciate those of you who comment and exchange ideas, even if we don't always agree. We can get into some spirited conversations about any number of things, whether it's voting or enlisting or these treaties and these and this language that gets used to suck us in and then dupe us later on, whether it's language associated with a treaty, a compact, or an MOU, whatever it is. And of course, I also appreciate those of you who share my my videos that we post on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, our Let's Talk Native TV channel. So I want to thank you for that. Hey, look, another thing I wanted to mention. As you all know, I lost a dear friend 10 days ago. Actually, yesterday was Armantur, who we knew as Kagweda Geru. It was his 10-day feast yesterday while I was in New York. And I think to put the passing of somebody who has been such a prominent figure for those of us fighting for sovereignty for the Haudenosaunee, that's Armantur, Sugar Montour's father. So Sugar Montour and his brothers and sisters, many of them, and there's many of them, he lost his father, and the 10-day feast was on Thursday. Well, this morning was the birth of his son. So you put that in perspective, this idea of those who live out all their days and those who begin their first day. And of course, my friend Sugar, celebrates the birth of his son today. I've got my friends like Holly and Ross John with their son Frank, expecting their child any day, waiting for the news any day. I had a good friend of mine down in New York, Jeremiah Jose, who's been on my show many times. He had celebrated the birth of his son just a couple of days ago. That's the cycle, right? That's the cycle of life. And so I wanted to, again, give an acknowledgement because after the 10-day, we know that we have let go. We have let go of a loved one. And the idea of reassembling that family fire for the Montour family has begun. And there's a new log on that fire. And so I want to congratulate Bruna and Sugar for the birth of their son. Again, I wanted to mention about this George Washington belt, and the thing about the George Washington belt is what wampum belts have been used for traditionally. They've been used as our account of an agreement we made, not just treaties here. I'm not talking about treaties with white men, but it's a way that Native people have communicated momentous occasions, and communicated their relationships with people. So, I mean, what we talk about oftentimes, and I've got it up here on my wall, the two-row wampum. It's called Deohade or Degani Deohade. It's or Goswanta, it's called. And in the whole idea of that wampum belt was to show that there's a path that we have that creation provided for us. And then there's another path. And that other path, and we've shared this wampum belt with people, many peoples over the centuries. Long before the first white men, we ever treated with or whatever else. We shared this concept with other Native people. In fact, the way it was explained to me is when we look at those two paths, that other path, one path is ours. The other path could be any other part of creation. And in fact, the first and most sacred relationship that we have is with creation. It's with nature. It's with all those things that we say in the Ohondo Gori Wadekwa. So we could argue, or at least suggest, that the Tuor Wampum lists our path and a reverence for all of the other paths. So the other path is just not our path. So it could be the path of plant life, of animal life, of water, of other peoples. And that wampum was that two-row wampum was offered to white men. But the problem is that it was never honored. So the whole idea of offering something that talks about mutual respect, and as it was offered to white men, we said, you don't have a path on our mother. So unlike the metaphor that we would use for this wampum belt normally, with somebody we've shared this land with, we're going to use a new metaphor. We're going to talk about those two paths as if they are two vessels on the river of life. And that one vessel for us would be our canoe. It would be the vessel that we travel that river of life with. And for you, it'll be the ship. And neither of our vessels will try to steer the other's vessels. And of course, in a previous time, we would have said neither one of these paths would attempt to steer the other path. But here, with white men, we use this specifically in terms of vessels because that was their only presence on our land. Essentially, was this is how they traveled across our land, by water and by these vessels. So I mean, so we would use these belts to communicate a relationship. There was no wampum belt created for the Canandaigua Treaty. Let me repeat that. There was no wampum belt created for the Canandaigua Treaty. Now, there was a wampum belt created, And George Washington commissioned a belt. So this isn't a belt that we created to establish our relationship with, with George Washington or the white man in the, after the Revolutionary War. But George Washington had a belt commission, and apparently it was an Oneida who created this belt. And in fact, the belt was created in a way that is inconsistent with the way that we use belts. It was obnoxiously long, over 6 foot long, not something that was easily, a tremendous amount of wampum went into it, obviously. And why would a tremendous amount of wampum? Because a white man was paying for it. And there might have been a little bit of compensation going on for something, and we can talk about that in another way, I guess. But, of course, you got to make it big, you got to make it long, right? It's a white man thing, I guess. So this 6 foot huge belt by almost any standard was commissioned by George Washington. And what it depicts is a house in the center with 2 little men on either side of that house, and then 13 large figures on either side of those 2 little men in the house. Now, and above the 2 little men is like an arbor or a yoke, you could say, over the top of the 2 men in the middle. Now, I've heard people, including, again, these iconic guys like Orrin and, Irv and, guys on Onondaga, describe what that George Washington belt means. And it simply isn't true. But again, what they say is that, the 13 figures are the 13 colonies, and the 2 figures there are the Mohawks and the Senecas, Eastern Door and Western Door. Now, of course, the last time I heard Orrin talk about this in Washington, which was only a couple of years ago, he tried to suggest that somehow it was Taradaho and the Ganawida. Yeah, that was one of the versions I heard from him last time, which is, again, is BS. But those little guys, the belt communicates a level of submission, of submissiveness, that we are the wee little guys amongst these men, and that they have somehow constructed something to protect us over our heads and to keep us beneath. Now, so I've got to say, this belt was actually commissioned several years, 2, maybe even 3 years before the terms of the Canandaigua Treaty were put to pen to ink to paper. So the pictograph, the images on that belt, have nothing to do with the words in the Canandaigua Treaty. And yet, they're going to pull that wampum belt out. They'll pull it out tomorrow. I heard somebody just said, oh, yeah, I'm going to have that wampum belt in hand tomorrow. Well, you can have that wampum belt in hand, but I'm sorry, it doesn't mean, it has nothing to do with the Canandaigua Treaty. You know what that Washington belt represents? It represents what Washington wanted. He wanted submission. He wanted the 6 nations. And, of course, there's only 2 images there. There's no 6 nations being represented by any imagery. They just have this little house and these 2 little men, and with being protected by the 13 bigger guys around him. That's what Washington wanted. That's not what he got. And in fact, he knew he wouldn't get it. So he may have gotten that imagery put into a belt just by commissioning somebody to construct this belt. But that belt is not our wampum belt. It's a belt of a white man. It doesn't matter even who made it, because it was made specifically for a white man. It wasn't our message using something that we considered somewhat sacred, the wampum, these beads that were, fashioned specifically for recording, words and recording a message. No, this was you want to talk about appropriation? This was an appropriation by George Washington of something that was symbolic to us, so he could try to use it as a propaganda tool. He wanted to offer this belt up and say, this is what I'm offering here. I'm offering to protect you. In fact, there are people who will look at that Washington and say, yeah, that's us agreeing to being under the protection of George Washington and the 13 colonies. Well, that might be what the belt communicates, but that's not what the language in Canandaigua is. In fact, there's nothing even close to that. In fact, in Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty, it specifies how we will deal with conflict amongst one another. And what it says is that if a white man commits a crime against a native person, that we will petition the authorities. We will petition the President of the United States to make sure that justice is served against the crime committed by that white man. And if one of our people committed a crime against theirs, they were supposed to petition the chiefs to make sure that justice. We weren't even supposed to administer justice against a crime committed against somebody from the other party. We were supposed to petition the leadership of the other party to make sure that justice was served. And of course, then the language says, "This shall be the way until other equitable provisions are made by the great legislature," or something like that. Equitable provisions. And when they say great legislature, some people say until Congress, deems something different. No, if it was equitable, it meant that we're supposed to be input if there was a change in that relationship. There never was. So the United States may claim, well, Article 7 is irrelevant anymore. And apparently, the 3 articles that mention that the land is ours and not theirs, they won't come right out and say it. They won't say it one way or the other. But they will still pay $4,500 a year for cloth. Look, the other thing is, I want to address another issue. There are words that we use, English words that we use, words that have origins from different places. One of the words that that has become so much a part of the native lexicon is the word sovereignty. Now, look, I understand where the word comes from. It's got a French base to it, and it has to do. I mean, when people talk about the sovereign, what they indicate, what they're suggesting is that God Himself placed certain authorities within specific families, these royal families, these 13 families of Europe. And of course, it's BS. I mean, it's one of the greatest lies ever told. I mean, no family was ever ordained by God to rule over other people. It's all bull. But what sovereignty has come to mean is the right or the authority to make your own decisions and to assert your own autonomy and distinction. So I want to be clear. When I use the word sovereign, I'm not talking about a king. I'm not talking about a God-given right. In fact, when the colonists were asserting their independence against the United Kingdom, they began to use language that they got from us that talked about unalienable rights bestowed by, they used the word creator, not even God, where we would have normally said bestowed by creation, or what we call the great mystery, which is that power of creation. But then, of course, they got to, make it a masculine God, O-R, so it's masculine, and turn it into a he God. But this concept that there's a birthright, that if creation created it, then it had the right to exist. That was just an inherent part of who we were. It was natural. So when you say inherent, means it was inseparable. You could not separate this notion that when we were born, we had the right to carry ourselves. Te watatawi. We had the right to carry ourselves. I mean, that's the closest word we have to to define, that would match up with the word sovereign or sovereignty. But when we use the word sovereignty, I'm not talking about something that God, or a royal family decreed. It's got nothing to do with church and nothing to do with God. But the word sovereign now is more associated with authority, with the right and autonomy, distinction, that kind of stuff. Now, of course, that's a word that some are scared of. So when the United States or even the United Nations wants to talk about things like self-determination, they're going to sometimes stop short of saying, well, self-determination is equivalent to sovereignty. Well, no, I think when I use the word sovereignty, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about self-determination. The right and the authority to choose your political status, to assert the boundaries of your lands, to assert who your people are or who they are not. That is self-determination by the international definition. And it also includes the right to assert authority over the lands that you retain, which, many people could associate with the word sovereignty. So look, I just want to be clear. There are certain words that I'm not willing to use. I don't use Indians, unless I'm doing air quotes somehow. I mean, when I talk about Indian country, I say that because that's a word that is being used. I mean, let's face it, it's called the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. There's nobody from India that's doing gaming on our territories. But again, misnomer. I don't use the word Native American. I use the word Native because it's benign, and but I do use the word sovereign and sovereignty. So I'm talking about our sovereign rights. In fact, a few years ago, I'm looking at a copy on my wall. I wrote something called the Declaration of Sovereignty, not a Declaration of Independence, but a declaration on our rights and authority to define our own path, the path on the Turo Wampum, a legitimate wampum belt, not an appropriated one like this Washington belt that'll be on display, some replica of it, but that'll be on display tomorrow in the little village of Canandaigua. It's they call this November, and they've done it since back, I think, to Reagan, or maybe even before that. They call November the National Native American Heritage Month. I got a chance to go speak at one of the schools in Buffalo. In fact, ironically, I spoke at the Magnet School, the Native American Magnet School, School 19 in Buffalo. A school that, in spite of the millions of dollars the Seneca Nation has been sending to the state, or I should say $1.5 billion the Seneca has sent to the state, some of which comes back to to cities like Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and Salamanca. The city of Buffalo has never funded. In fact, there's not one full-time Native teacher at the Native American Magnet School in Buffalo. I got a chance to go speak at that school. I think I spoke to 8th graders. And I talked to them. I talked to them about how the history and culture is being presented to them. It's being presented to them as history, as something in the past, even our culture. Nobody's talking about the culture that exists today. Now, we could argue what that culture is today. I mean, is the lifestyles that we live the culture? And perhaps it is. So are the poverty issues that Native people face? Is that our culture? Or is that something that's been is that a part of oppression and imposition on us? Drugs, alcohol, poverty, unemployment, all that stuff. Is that our culture? See, I don't think it is. I think that's what we're resisting as we try to cling on to a culture that we're trying to bring forward. But the problem is, if we're only going to teach the culture as something that it once was, that isn't anymore, then that's exactly what it becomes. It becomes something that isn't anymore. And I don't accept that. I don't accept that. I think we have the right and the authority, the sovereign right and authority, to bring forward our culture today. We can come up with other solutions to problems, to conflicts. We can employ, uniquely Haudenosaunee concepts in terms of resolving conflict and advancing certain things. Are we doing enough of that? No, I don't think we are. But I'm still hopeful. But some of that has to start with stop trying to treat with us. I mean, National Native American Heritage Month? Heritage? And then when I read what the presidents, including what Donald Trump wrote, this is a time when Americans should learn about the history of Native Americans and how we have impacted American history. Well, wait a second. That's not what our lives were about. Our lives, the purpose of our being on the planet was not to shape the United States. In fact, we've been at odds with these European, travelers, these trespassers, and we're still at odds every single day with the state of New York, with the United States, with the states. I mean, I think about a senator in Missouri who is trying to pass legislation to stop a business transaction that's happening in Mohawk territory in Akwesasne. They're trying to do a transaction to market the regulatory advantages as it relates to a pharmaceutical product. And Claire McCaskill in Missouri says, no, they're just exploiting a loophole, and damn it, I'm going to close it. Who the hell is this woman to do this? This is the world that we live in. We live in this world of absolute contradiction, as the ones I talked about in the beginning of the program. The contradiction between the language in the Canandaigua Treaty and the language in the Doctrine of Discovery. The rulings of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice John Marshall, and the language of the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act. These are conflicts. These are contradictions. And we should cite the language that they chose to put to paper that is more specific to us, rather than letting somebody beat us up over these broad racist doctrines that the United States employed as they try to put Native people onto concentration camps. That's what we need to do. Look, I'm going to go out. The other thing that, as I said during the break, November 1st is also the anniversary of the opening of the Carlisle Indian School, which is one of the U.S. flagship institutions to kill the Indian to save the man. So I'm going to go out with Murray Porter's song dedicated to the survivors of residential schools, of boarding schools, and it is Sorry Enough.
Now you say you're sorry. It's not what you say, it's what you do. Tell us you'll do better, but it's hard to believe in you. The day has finally come, told the world that you were wrong. Far too many have passed on now. When it's sorry, took away our children, stole our mothers down, laid waste to our traditions. Wasn't that enough? Separated from our culture so many years, so alone, with no mothers and no fathers, in a world so far from forced to use another language, punished well. You spoke your native tongue, trying to kill our spirit here, but our hearts still beat as one. Took away